Now let's take a look at a couple of very different pieces and analyze them in terms of contrast and relationship and how all the parts fit together. This is a piece called View of the Harbor, and it's one of mine. And this series was based on collecting vintage needlework pieces and then combining them in a set of still life pictures, most of which are about the size of this one, 40 by 48, so kind of medium sized. If we look first at contrasting color, we can see that obviously this piece has a lot of color happening in it. But one of the things that is true is that there are a couple of places where the colors are high contrast and in fact complementary colors, and they are the red and the green, the poinsettia-like flowers in the tall vase, and then down below the little mummy-looking daisy sorts of flowers that are in that wooden bucket. A variety of colors, but definitely we see here the contrast of the complements with the yellow and the purple, and then in a more overall way with the orange and the blue, for example, the tiny rosebuds that are on the railing as you look outside on the porch. There are a variety of sets of value contrast here. So we have the darker beige that is the part of the original needlepoint above and around the cat, and then the beige paint that was mixed to mimic that same color, which is how I created the screen and printed that same patterning onto the rest of the wall behind the cat. And then we have a very soft shift in value from almost white through pale blue, turquoisey blue, into the bluer part of the sky at the very top of the window, but a very soft sort of subtle shift of value there. And then we also have the value in the floor where you can, or on the tabletop there, where you see a range of sort of a butterscotchy, ochre, golden color, but a range from light to dark of that particular value. Now, in terms of size contrast, we have pretty obvious size contrast because we have the large flowers and the larger leaves, and we also have the smaller flowers and the smaller leaves, and those are reflected from the very smallest bouquets, which are out there on the porch railing, and then, of course, the plants to the right of the cat, and then the medium-sized bucket of plants, and then, of course, the very large ones. We also have vertical elements in this section, and they vary in size. They make up the grid that begins as the needlepoint is carried through in the printing. Also, the vertical nature of that tall vase, and also the vertical nature of the porch railings and the surrounds on the window. The contrast in shape comes along a couple of different places. We have the roundness of the flowers and the roundness of that stone-like texture in the tabletop, contrasted with the squares of the needlepoint and the squares of the printed background that mimics the needlepoint. Then we also have the contrast of the containers in a looser way that hold all of the plants, and we have the contrasts of those vertical elements that make up the porch. From a textural standpoint, we have exactly the sort of textural contrast that I mentioned earlier in this presentation. We have the original texture, which is the real texture of the needlepoint, and we have it juxtaposed with the faux, F-A-U-X, fake texture or printed texture that I created by copying the needlepoint designs with pen and ink and turning them into a silkscreen so that I could extend that background that was the needlepoint into the rest of the composition. Another contrasting textural element is the texture of these wool flowers, the crewel in the vase, and crewel meaning C-R-E-W-E-L, not like don't be cruel, versus the wooliness of those flowers versus the flowers that are embroidered onto the very small sailboat piece, and those are actually done in kind of a shiny rayon floss. But another variation in the texture here comes because the little sailboat piece was originally about 8 inches by 10 inches, so it's not very large, and in order to incorporate it into this composition, I first fused it into the background, and then I hand painted the sky and that range very soft value to blend the piece into the background. And then I hand painted the rest of the porch railings and stitched along them with black pearl cotton to emphasize them and to blend that little tiny piece into the overall surface. And so we have a contrast of the original texture of that small embroidery with the painted surface and the fabric, which is a silk noil, so it has a little bit of nubby texture. We have a very subtle texture contrast there. From a stylistic standpoint, probably the most obvious contrast in this particular piece is the contrast between the four varieties of needlework. So we have the needlepoint where the cat is located, which is essentially done over a white cotton grid. So it's a very geometric way of working. Then we have the free-form hand embroidery of the red poinsettia-like flowers, and we have the bucket of flowers that are the wool crewel embroidery at the bottom. And those are all a little bit different stylistically. You can't range too, your path can't range too far afield without breaking the composition so that it doesn't hang together anymore. So I hope in this particular case, because of the other elements I added, I was able to put these pieces that are stylistically a little bit different from each other together, but the contrast of each of them helps contribute interest to the surface. And then we don't want to leave out that embroidery with the rayon floss of the little sailboat. If we think about thematic contrast, those are the parts of the story that make it interesting. And so all of this hangs together. You would expect to see a cat with the plants. You would expect to see the plants together. It's not unusual at all to be able to look out across a balcony and see a Mediterranean or a Lake Erie or, name your body of water series here. But all of the parts tell the story of a lazy afternoon. Now let's think about how relationship is indicated in this particular piece, and it happens on lots of different levels. And so the same elements, remember, that created the contrast are the elements that will create the relationship. So if we go back and analyze this now from the standpoint of relationship with color, we see that in fact those complementary relationships are pretty important. So we have the red and the green, and we have several different versions of red and green, but the bottom line relationship of those two complementary colors, again meaning opposites on the color wheel, we have them represented here, big and bold and right in your face, probably the focal point, the entry into the picture world. Then we can also see that there is this relationship. Your eye moves around inside that little bucket that has the smaller flowers in it, from the purple flowers to the yellow flowers, bounce back and forth there with that complementary relationship. And then I wanted to be sure to point out how you can start to look at a piece once you're getting these terms under your belt and understand how to use them. You can enjoy looking at a piece like this and seeing less obvious connections and less obvious ways that your eye is led through a composition by the placement of the color and the relationships of the color. Analogous colors are colors that are next door to each other on the color wheel. So yellow is next door to yellow-orange, and yellow-orange is next door to orange, and orange is next door to red-orange. Same thing's true as you go around the color wheel. We want to keep it a fairly narrow relationship, or once again it gets too far afield and they're no longer really neighbors. But in this particular case, look at how the orange leads your eye across the composition and keeps popping up. So if we start with the orange flowers that are really obvious in that wooden bucket at the bottom, you can see that that orange shows up again on the left next to the cat. The orange shows up again as the embroidery around the center in those red poinsettia-like flowers, and then there's that orange again over there on the porch railing. And so your eye is led by that orange, maybe not in a way that you actually thought about or recognized. It's a very subtle way of leading the eye, and yet an artist can deliberately set out to help you look through the picture world by following those color cues. From a value standpoint, now we have relationship a couple of different ways. We have the contrast, of course, which is the part that makes it interesting, but it hangs together cohesively here because the sky is a smooth blend of value that incorporates the white and the very, very pale blue in addition to that brighter, more saturated blue. So there is a relationship because it's the same blue. It's not four different blues or four different values of different blues, which would be a completely different setup. In the leaves, we can see the values of green, and that gives some dimension to the leaves and helps make it more interesting, but it also builds the relationship of making us see them more as real leaves with a dimension as opposed to just being a flat surface. From a size standpoint, we have a couple of things that build relationship here. One is, of course, the texture that was printed as opposed to the texture in the needlepoint, but the pattern has been repeated so that it's exactly the same size as what's in the needlepoint, and that builds the relationship and extends that patterning onto the wall behind the cat. Then there's the tiny patterning that is the right scale to be on this vase, and so it's lots of little different marks, but they're very close together in size, and that helps create this vase that has a cohesiveness of the patterning on it. Then we have the relationship that is developed by having these small pom-pom flowers, and they're very close in size to that stone-like texture that's represented on the tabletop. From a shape relationship, there are a couple of different ways to look at it, but I wanted to point out one that might not be as obvious as the fact that all of the little flowers are very similar shapes in that wooden bucket, and all of the flowers at the top, those poinsettias, are very similar shapes, and the leaves are similar shapes, and the squares of patterning are similar shapes. But look at how shape can also define areas of a composition. And so your eye is led by a triangle because it has those 3 points. It's not a static shape. So your eye tends to move around the triangle from point to point. And here we have several sets of triangles happening at once. We've got the triangle created by the 3 red flowers. Then we have the triangular shape, which I've superimposed over those 2 plants to the right of the cat. And then we have the bouquet in the little wooden bucket, and that's actually kind of a triangular composition also. And then we have the composition that is triangular of the shape of that sailboat. So these are really interesting, fun ways to build relationship into the piece you're working on by creating these secondary shapes and directions that your eye can move as it travels through the picture world. And if you pay attention to what you're doing, you can do this too. From a textural standpoint, we talked about the fact that the contrast is created by having this printed version of the needlepoint stitchery. And so we have that faux contrasty texture, but I used the same pattern to create the printed image that was found in the needlepoint image, and so that actually creates relationship also simultaneously. Pretty great. Then if you look carefully on the right-hand detail, you'll be able to see just a little corner of the machine stitching that I used when I completed the tabletop, and I created the tabletop pattern, or the secondary pattern, by using cross-hatching created by the quilting machine. And you can see that cross-hatching was deliberately taken from the surface underneath the cat in the original needlepoint piece. So you can see that cross-hatching there, and essentially what I did was just carry that pattern out into the tabletop. So you wouldn't necessarily even recognize that as a textural relationship, and yet it's there to be discovered if you look carefully enough. From a stylistic standpoint, I think in this case the contrast is probably a more interesting version of what's happening than anything that is related stylistically to relationship. The piece fits together thematically, but the contrast of the styles is what makes it interesting or keeps it interesting. If all of this had been, if it had all been similar, if all of the needlepoint everything was needlepoint, or everything was wool crewel embroidery, or everything was hand painted, it would have a completely different appeal. That's a good question. Would it be as appealing as this piece is because of the contrast? So that's one of the ways you can analyze what you're doing, is to think about whether the contrast you're creating is actually an inherent part of the piece that makes it more interesting than it would be if everything was more seamless stylistically. And from a thematic standpoint, everything holds together. There's a lot of contrast happening here, and as I just said, a lot of it is stylistic contrast, but from the standpoint of all of the parts telling the story, everything seems to be long, everything seems to fit, and everything seems to create a cohesive, seamless picture that you can enjoy and that you can then project your own story onto, if that's what the viewer gets to do. You get to tell your own version of the story that I began in my own mind with my hands. Now let's look briefly at another piece, this time a piece that is non-representational, meaning it was originally a quilt. And so the block forms that you see, all of those shapes, were part of the original quilt pattern, and I maximized the quilt pattern by gold leafing the entire thing. I could still see the texture, and then I proceeded to paint very sheer layers of color onto the surface using a series of thermofax screens, which are like small silk screens. So this will be a little bit different story when it comes to analyzing the components of relationship and contrast, because it isn't telling us a story in the same way that the first piece did. So is there a story here? From a contrasting point of view, we have color contrast, and we have the dark oranger shapes and we have the dark bluer shapes. They are not the pure versions of the color, obviously, or they'd be a lot more in your face. They're very subtle versions, but there is color contrast. And there's also the color contrast of the lavender printing, as you can see in the area I highlighted at the bottom, with the gold in the background, which translates loosely into yellow. And so there we have another complementary relationship. From a value contrast standpoint, we have a range of value, but it's a relatively subtle range of value. We don't have anything that's really black that knocks your socks off. We have a little bit of white, but we have mainly this soft value progression that includes all of the colors that are represented on the surface. Contrast in size is fairly evident. There's a lot of contrast in size here. There are the squares that I've highlighted and the very small squares that are set on the diagonal, and then there are the squares that are implied in the background that were part of the original quilt pattern. So there is a contrasting set of elements here in that regard. There are also contrasting elements in terms of shape, because the original quilt pattern created these shapes that you see that I've highlighted there in the circle to the right, in addition to the squares that are on the diagonal, in addition to the square that I've highlighted on the left. So there are a variety of shapes here, including the triangles, that are different from each other. One of the interesting things to point out, though, is that some of the shapes are real shapes, meaning they're real squares that have been printed, or they're real triangles that have been printed, but in some cases they're only the illusion of a shape, and so that highlighted section on the right gives you a sense of a circle without it actually being a circle. The contrast of texture in this piece happens in several different ways. The original surface, as I said, was a quilt top, and that was gold leafed entirely. And so we have the contrast of that gold leaf versus the matte painted surface that I added via my printing. Then there are squares of paper applied to the surface, and those contrast with both the leafing and the paint. And then we have the texture of the fusible web. You can sort of see that in the lower third. The gold surface looks a little bit broken, and that is because the fusible web texture is showing through, as is some of the original quilted fabric surface. And so those contrast with the paint and the leaf. From a stylistic standpoint, not every aspect of contrast is always used. In this particular piece, it's a pretty cohesive, seamless surface. There's not a lot of difference stylistically, and there doesn't necessarily need to be in order for the piece to be valid and complete and interesting, because the other elements can carry it. So one of the points that I wanted to make by showing you these pictures is to be sure you remember that not every single element has to be used every single time. And there may or may not be an obvious theme in a piece that's non-representational. In this piece, the theme is the repetitive pattern that is based on the original quilt, but if there's any symbolic meaning at all, if there's a story this piece is telling, you're either going to get it from the title that I gave the piece, you're going to get it from the artist's statement that you might read that would usually be provided when you look at artwork like this, or the meaning is going to come from your own imagination, and in that case it'll be projected onto the piece. Quick look at relationship where this particular piece is concerned, and as was true in the first piece that we looked at, we have defensible color relationships here because we have sets of complements happening. We've got the duller orange contrasted with the dull blue. We've got that lavendery sort of violet contrasted with the gold leaf, which is perceived as yellow. And then we have some lesser relationships color-wise, but those are probably the dominant ones that build relationship on the surface. From a value standpoint, this is a pretty low-key value set of images. There is some contrast. Of course, we've got the white triangles that float out from the surface, hopefully, and then we've got the darker areas that recede, and in between we have a lot of value, but it's a very low value relationship. It's not screamingly contrasting. And lots of size contrast here. We have the diagonal, the squares, and the triangles, and we have the larger blocks. So we have a lot of elements of different sizes, but we have relationship among them because of the repetitive nature of how they're organized and how they're presented. And from the relationship of shape, I added actually two grids that are superimposed. The white grid points out the original nature of the square blocks that were part of the quilt before it was gold leafed, and then the red grid points out the relationship of the shapes that are on the diagonal, those squares that are actually, so what's happening here is actually having two grids superimposed on top of each other, and then all that other value and color information happening across that sort of a net that is the structure of the composition. And this close-up shows you a little bit more about what I was talking about here. We have the contrast of the texture, and you can see the grid, or the sort of webby texture, not really a grid, but the webby texture of the Misty Fuse, which was the fusible used to fuse the gold leaf to the surface. And so we have that surface underneath the entire printed surface. And so that texture keeps the piece cohesive from one end to the other because it exists across the entire piece, and then it contrasts, and you can really see it here with the paper that was applied to the surface and the printed imagery. This piece really does show more relationship from a stylistic standpoint than it does contrast. The elements that were printed were all created the same way. They were all created using one original that was kind of a spray paint surface that was cut into the varied shapes, and so each of them looks, from a textural standpoint, I guess that's another version of texture I hadn't really thought of, they look very similar to each other even though they're varied in terms of the sizes and the shapes that they are. But stylistically, the piece is pretty tight, and contrast of style is not an important element here in the way that it was in the first piece that we studied. And from a thematic standpoint, it's important to point out that sometimes both thematic and stylistic relationships aren't that obvious until you see the entire series. If you looked at all 14 of the pieces in this series, you would see that I used the same basic style throughout, and that I used in my own mind, I thought of each of them as a structure, and I gave each of them a title, and the titles were all related to relationships. because I was projecting relationships onto these grids that were originally quilts as I completed them one by one. And so they were telling me a poetic story about relationship that looks like just a geometric composition, but of course I was imbuing it with a whole new meaning. You wouldn't have to pick up on that in order to appreciate this piece visually, but if you read the titles of the work or you read my artist statement, then that would perhaps get your mind spinning in a whole new direction as far as the theme of the pieces or what they would say to you symbolically. And once again, that's the perfect circle of sharing work with a viewer, is that the viewer gets to put his or her own spin on the work that they're looking at, and it can tell their story, which is what makes the appreciation of art, in addition to the creation of art, such a rich experience. So I hope looking at a piece and discussing it in the way that I have is a helpful way for you to think about your own work and how to use the elements of contrast and relationship effectively in the pieces that you make from this point forward. And I hope you'll enjoy doing that. And if you enjoy it, you may actually want to check out a class that I teach online that is a composition class. And contrast and relationship is only one small part of what we talk about in that class. The whole point is to recharacterize all these design strategies using terminology that we can all understand easily so that we're not blocked by the terminology and we can get on with the creating. And so check that out. The details will be below or on my website. And I hope to see you there.